Hi everyone, so the Season 6 PTR has already concluded a few days ago. I've been pumping out some videos about new and fancy and improved builds that you may have seen, and there's more to come of that. But I also want to share my combined feedback that I have gathered throughout playing the PTR. I've been blasting it like for a week straight, every day, like 12 hours plus. So I have a lot of feedback to give. I'll try to keep it as short as possible. I compiled a list on stream the other day and just kind of discussed this with people and added a few points from just the community as well to have like a bit more of like extra voice, I guess, coming in there. And I've also already forwarded a lot of this to Blizzard directly, to the devs and so on. Right now, I don't really know what of those things that I suggest might be included in the final patch. There is definitely more feedback than I think they could handle. And of course, I'm not the only person giving feedback, but I think there are certainly like lots of improvements they could make to make Season 6 and the expansion as a whole, like throughout all of its seasons, way better than what it looks like it would be right now. That being said, I am very happy with the state of the game. I think they have done a good job. I think Vessel of Hatred is going to be amazing, basically no matter what, especially if they, bug fix stuff, if they fix like the biggest issues. And then we'll see what else they will do that kind of comes from my wish list. So let's jump into it and I'll show you what I got here. So we have a lot of different topics. I'm going to talk about Stat Squish, then the progression and difficulties, build diversity, the Paragon glyph rework, the runes, then a bunch of stuff for all the classes here, and a bit of general stuff and my long-term wish list for something that I don't expect we will see anytime soon. So let's start with the Stat Squish. This is probably my biggest point of concern, which is also kind of like the least relevant at the same time, which is kind of interesting. But yeah, on one hand, it seems like they wanted to do a Stat Squish in this game. And for example, lower damage numbers. This is something that people have been complaining about ever since basically the game came out. It started with 2 large numbers, and then we got insane amounts of power creeps throughout Season 1 to 5. And here we are with like builds that have billions or dozens of billions of DPS. And then we thought, okay, the expansion comes out, they are squishing stuff, and it turns out we are doing more damage than before, not less. Not like, 100 times less, not 1,000 times less. No, we're doing more than before. And I think that is a huge missed opportunity at the very least, and mildly upsetting, let's say. I was hoping we would go down to something like, 5 digits, 6 digits or so, maybe, some big hitters like Bone Spirit hitting like in the millions, let's say. I think something like that would have been okay. And this would correspond to like a numbers decrease of something like 1,000 times to 10,000 times. And I think this is kind of like what they should have aimed at. That being said though, I mean, the overall balance of the game seems kind of alright. If you look at like, the at least top builds between each classes. However, with this expansion update and with like all the new toys that some builds are getting that don't really work that well for other builds, the overall balance between the game that has actually been fairly good in Season 5, for example, has definitely shifted and everything is like way further apart again. The game's difficulty ceiling has massively been risen, at least across the non-pit content, let's say. So when you go to Torment 4 and the new difficulty system, a lot of builds will probably start struggling and they might not even get there, where currently right now everyone can do whispers and just one-shot everything, or hell tides and just one-shot everything and so on. So that is also not something I enjoy, but it kind of balanced out the performance of builds much better than what we got now. But in terms of stat squishing, I would have liked to see a lot more being done here. For example, reducing the amount of main stat. In fact, we doubled our main stat, and for some reason Blizzard also doubled the contribution of main stat. So basically they squished the weapons and then they made up for it entirely with just that main stat change, which is very strange. I think glyphs in general are too powerful. For example, when I progress with my character here, this is a rogue that I've leveled from scratch with nothing, and I ended up in Torment 4 after like, I think 16 hours or something like that. And the interesting part about this is that almost all of my progression and my power increase as I progressed through the end game from Torment 1 to Torment 4 happened through glyphs, and I guess to some degree through extra Paragon levels. So I didn't actually really upgrade my gear, I didn't farm any uniques, any bosses, I didn't farm any mythic items, I barely masterworked my gear. This was almost exclusively just through glyphs. And then we are in the final difficulty, and I'm already kind of just blasting through it with pretty crappy gear, to be honest. So that is a huge problem, I think. Like the highest difficulty should be something reserved for like, you know, really high-end builds. And I was not even playing the strongest build out there. So in general, I think the numbers need to go down. Player power in general also needs to go down. And the expansion offers us the perfect opportunity because this is a blank slate, nothing matters. And I think that this should really be the time to really adjust numbers down, because now we can establish like a new baseline of power, and we can establish like a new progression that, or like a, you know, a speed of progression that makes more sense than what we saw in the PTR. I do expect that even without my feedback, some of these things will happen, because a lot of people were complaining that Torment 4 was way too easy, and the expectation was, I think Blizzard has said that only like, you know, the super high-end blasters will get to Torment 4 and comfortably farm it, which I think is exactly where it should be. And it's not like you're losing out on anything really, for example, by staying in Torment 1 or 2 or Torment 3. There is nothing that unlocks later. It's just like better, faster, more efficiency, more XP and these kind of things. You might get slightly more loot. So it's not like you unlock something in Torment 4 that you can't have in Torment 1. And in that case, I think they should really make use of this difficulty system and actually make the higher end difficulties extremely hard, so that people have something to work on and really, like, you know, chew basically. So that is kind of a problem here. So yeah, I think an extra squish would definitely help, in particular the main stats and the glyph stuff. And we also have more here. So item power inflation is another topic here. So I think they did a really good job with the item power progression from level 1 to 50. Everything is kind of just like closer together, and it's not like, for example, in Season 5 on the live server where you start a character, you don't find a weapon upgrade for 5 levels, tough luck, you know, and then you get one eventually and suddenly, boom, triple the damage or something like that. So I think that was kind of stupid with how that worked currently in the live game, and that has been much improved. So you go 5 levels up and your weapon is like, I don't know, 10 or 15% stronger. So it's not such a big deal if you get unlucky, and the progression just feels way more smoothed out. So I think that was really good and really well done. But then comes level 50 to level 60. And between those, I don't know the numbers exactly, but you go from something like item power of, I don't know, 500 or 400 something to 750 in a matter of 10 levels. And all the stats on all of your gear is just like double or triple compared to before. The DPS is way higher on your weapons. And there's like no reason to do that, I feel. I think this is kind of a mistake. And I think just generally the top end of 800 item power should just be lower to kind of like bring everything closer together to this leveling journey gear. Because item power 800 gear is ancestral gear that has 1 greater affix, that can be double tempered, can be masterwork to 12. So ancestral gear is already way more powerful than all the other gear that exists anyway. I don't really see a reason to like also inflate the item power all that much. And this would lead us to just generally lower numbers on our gear, generally a better progression curve, I think, and also a way more like meaningful high-end difficulty in the form of Torment 4, and then the pit scaling even further than that. So yeah, this is kind of like what I have to put in here. I think that stat squishing would be kind of the main avenue here, instead of trying to like necessarily nerfing every single build into the ground one by one or something like that. All this stuff would affect almost every build almost the same, and you can still kind of like fix stuff from there later on, I think. So I think this is really where we should go. Like, I don't even like having like 4,000% increased damage on my gear and my glyphs, for example, because it also makes these stats relatively meaningless. Like, you look at your item and your crossbow says, you know, plus 200% crit damage, and you're like, whoa, that's so much. But realistically, it's giving you like 4% DPS or something like that, which I think is just kind of stupid. The numbers are like way too much. The numbers on the screen, if you would like to keep them on, are just way too much, way too large, and so on. So I think this would be much more reasonable to lower them. Now, I did talk about progression difficulties a little bit already. So the problem was that getting to Torment 4 is too easy, especially for meta builds, or, you know, like anyone who knows the game well. I also had many people on my streams, on my Discord, and people discussing not just the super high-end blasters like me that would have an easy time in Torment 4. So combined with what I just said, I think if they bring down player power quite a bit, then this will probably kind of solve itself, depending on how much they bring it down. Realistically, I don't really expect like sweeping nerfs to everything and like, you know, insane reductions of the factor of like, you know, 100 or like 1,000 or something. But I could imagine like a nerf of like half to maybe times 10 that Blizzard might include here, especially if they actually decide to touch glyphs. Glyphs are a huge source of power right now, and those can definitely be adjusted a bit. And then I think that this whole progression and difficulty system would make a lot more sense. Another point I have here about Penitent difficulty, this is one of the 4 leveling up difficulties that we're gonna have. So there's gonna be normal, hard, expert, Penitent. Penitent only unlocks at level 50, and then you stop in Penitent at level 60. So if you want, you can spend like, I don't know, half an hour, 1 hour or so in Penitent, and that's about it, which just seems kind of pointless. And I think there should be maybe some one-time unlock. I think it's fine that Penitent is not available for like your first character ever or something like that, because realistically you have no chance there if it's not a twink, and it's really something only for twinks. So if you have your mythics ready, or at least you have your, you know, tempers and your aspects already prepared, and you lose like leveling caches and whatnot, then I think Penitent does make sense. But I think it's fine that it's locked for the first character, and then maybe the first time you reach level 60 you unlock it, or maybe the first time you reach level 50 if you really want to. Another thing is also the ancestral drop rates. I found the low ancestral drop rates very refreshing. It just makes it so that you are excited about every single item that drops when it has a star on it, and that was very nice, I think, compared to the live game right now, where I think we just get too much of that, and then it's like too much trash. It didn't really feel like it was, you know, that was happening too often. And instead, for example, there would be like a, you know, an item with a star that drops, you know, once a run or once every 2 runs or something like that. And we get like a few of them per hour, and it just kind of feels nice, and everything else is kind of like salvage trash. I think in general there could be more of a loot reduction, or like a, you know, like replacement of normal loot with ancestral loot eventually. I think there was also a bug on the PTR that there were just fewer ancestrals dropping than they should have. So I think that is going to be fine. So that we get like a decent income of good ancestral items, but not too many. So generally I like this. However, when it comes to uniques, that was a whole different deal. So getting ancestral legendaries was fine, but getting ancestral uniques was not fine, I gotta say. So you have to farm those bosses, and in Torment 4 you get 5 uniques per kill. It's basically similar to the Tormented bosses right now on the live server. You get 5 items. Could kill many of them without getting a single ancestral unique, because I think the same drop rates that apply to ancestral legendaries also apply to uniques. But uniques are generally much more rare. Like you get legendaries, you know, like hundreds per hour, but you get uniques like a few basically. Or maybe if you do, you know, boss rotations all day long, okay, you get a lot, of course, but you also have to go and farm those mats for them, and then you have to go do those boss rotations. And in general, it felt too punishing, I guess, when it comes to uniques. So I think they could get maybe a bit of like a boost to be ancestral, maybe depending on the difficulty or something like that. Or just in general, like since uniques pop up so infrequently, it would be nice if they had a higher chance to roll ancestral, because on top of that, we also have the stat rolls on them, we also have the power roll and so on. So there is a lot of RNG involved here, and I think it's kind of nice that we are sticking to legendary items a little bit longer than we used to. But it seems like so hard to get ancestrals that it's easier to get mythic items that are good before you ever finish your ancestral normal uniques, and that's a bit weird, I gotta say. Speaking of mythics, there's actually a topic that I didn't cover at the start here, but I would really like to see a cap of 1 mythic equipped per character. And this is something I've discussed a lot on stream, and yeah, some people really like that. Some people say, oh, what about the poor barbs? And I say, yeah, just fix the barbs afterwards, you know. It's not that hard. So I think that 1 mythic per character would make sense, because it would actually allow you to make a decision about which items you want to use, and it would also allow a lot more aspects and a lot more uniques. Their like time in the sun a little bit. So right now I feel like whenever I try to put together like endgame builds and build guides and so on, you almost always end up with like, you know, 2, more like 3 or 4 mythic items per build, and they're always the same candidates. There's always either a Shaco or a Partition Helm, then there's always the Shroud of False Death or the Tyraels in a chest slot, and then almost every build goes with the Starter's Ring as well. And then if you're a Barb, most of the time you also have a Grandfather, and it's kind of like how the build just kind of builds itself, let's say, when it comes to like the higher end setups, and you know, the people that really blast, and you know, the kind of the goal that you have. And then you also have the problem that when you create other builds, or like, let's say you want to play 3 characters in a season, then you just reuse like half of your gear for the next character. And personally, I don't find that so fun. Like I enjoyed it much more in season 4, where we were generally using a lot more legendaries, because I had to go and farm with my new build that I had just created, versus yeah, now I just equipped like the same 5 mythics, and then like another 2 or 3 uniques that kind of go with that as well. And I need like 1 or 2 legendaries that it's like like a weapon or something that I temper with different mods, and then my new build is completely ready. And I have no journey, I have nothing to do with that build after I've already completed the journey once with one of my main characters. So I don't really like that very much. And in general, I also just don't like that they're just so mindless about the mythics. The mythics are just so overstarted and so powerful that you just have to throw them in your build basically in almost every single case. And there's like no competition, even with like a lot of like very interesting class specific uniques. If you're looking at helms, for example, okay, there's a bunch of Druid helms that are required for certain builds to function because of the, like transform into bear or skill and these kind of things, like Vasili's Prayer. But in most cases, yeah, there is cool, unique helms, but you just can't use them like a Godslayer helm, for example. I really like these items, but they just make no sense to be used when something like Shaco or Perdition Helm exists. And we have like the same problem with chest pieces, you have the same problem with rings, and so on. So I think if there was like, a reason to really decide which of the mythic items you want to use, it would make theory crafting a lot more interesting, it would make build crafting a lot more interesting. It would also kind of like lower the grind that you have to do, which I think is not that terrible when it comes to mythic items. And it would just be like a way better feeling, I think, progressing with your characters, trying to put them together. And then, in fact, with that one mythic limitation, they could even buff mythics to make them even crazier and even more fun to use, or even more specialized or something like that. So right now, they're all just kind of like generic stat sticks, with a few exceptions like Andariels, let's say, and they're just not really that interesting. That being said though, I think with some of these changes combined with like maybe a bit of tweaking on the difficulties, this could work out relatively well here. I did talk about like the overall difficulty stuff now a lot, but I think it's also kind of like the biggest problems that we have right now in the game. So the power level of players, the numbers, and everything is kind of like out of whack because I think the devs just didn't anticipate we would have such strong builds. But yeah, everything just seems way crazier than before and way more powerful than before. And this is not exactly where we should start the expansion, I think. There is future patches, there's probably like more systems that come in. We don't even have a season theme, we don't even have mercenaries right now, and so on. So we are already gonna start at a higher level than what we experienced on the PTR. And yeah, I think something needs to be done. Talking about general build diversity. So I just have a few points here. I talked about this a little bit. Generally, I really like where we're going. A lot of builds have been created thanks to this patch. In particular, rogues are the big winners here. They have like 5 new endgame builds and they have like so much stuff and everything is good. So that's really cool. There's like, new skills for all the classes. So some of them are more, as a carry and more as a support. Like the familiar on the Sorc, for example, is not really its own build. It's more like a, you kind of like throw it into a build here and there and that's about it. And that's okay. I think Stoneburst is probably like the biggest problem here, but more on that later. But yeah, in general, I think build diversity is cool. The ranks and ultimates is cool. That enables a lot of new stuff, which is nice. I think it's also going to be very fun to try on the Spiritborn, for example. One point of feedback maybe here is that we have a lot of builds these days that actually are not really builds around a main skill, but more around an item effect or like some proc or something like that. So Victimized Rogues, Andariel, there's stuff like Azura, Frostburn, and it's fine that these builds exist, but I think we have too many of them. And in particular, for example, for rogues, like, I don't know, more than half or so, I would say, of the really good builds are based on stuff like that. And I think that's a bit too much. And I would like to see some actual viable options as like a, a core skill build, for example, where, it's kind of weird to like play a build and you have like 1 rank only in your core skill, or 0 ranks if you use a Harlequin Crest occasionally. So this is something that's maybe going a bit too far at this point. Now let's talk about Paragon Glyphs. I talked about glyphs are too powerful, so this could be squished. In general, I think that also a lot of the legendary effects are just not really very interesting. They're all something like, okay, you deal increased damage to vulnerable enemies, deal increased poison damage, you deal increased damage while healthy, and they're basically just like different flavors of 20% extra DPS. And then you have 5 of those glyphs, you get like double the damage or triple, and that's about it. And that is like just too boring. Now I don't really expect like a major rework at this point in time, since we are too short and right ahead of the expansion. So yeah, I think the train has kind of left here for this, but I would have liked to see way cooler stuff. Like adding skill tags to your skills when you have a certain glyph, or, you know, transforming all of your damage to another type, or, you know, maybe enabling some scalar of some other sort, or maybe you have a permanent imbuement in addition to whatever imbuement you use. You know, this kind of stuff. You know, there could have been very interesting legendary glyph effects, and that don't necessarily have to be like, you know, just like 20% damage in one flavor or another flavor. So I think they could have enabled a lot of cool stuff, but they didn't, and I think that's kind of sad. And when it comes to expansion 2, I would really like to see a rework of glyphs yet again to make them more interesting in kind of a direction of what I just described. But yeah, other than that, I think the new Paragon system is relatively decent. So we have a limitation of 5 boards maximum, which kind of works for most builds, but we do have the problem that there are also many builds that don't have 4 legendary nodes that they want to use. And or they have like, you know, 4 legendary nodes, but at least 1 or 2 of them are kind of like really wonky, and you have to do like, you know, some build acrobatics in order to use them. And you know, for example, we had Necros with Flesh Eater on board that forced you to use like corpse skills in many builds in the past. And yeah, we're kind of getting in a direction where you can leave that out, but this is like one of those cases. And this is similar cases for example, rogues. They have the Deadly Ambush board that forces you to use traps in your build in order to use that 4th legendary node, and so on. So I think we're just kind of like missing more options, more boards, and I would actually like to see maybe some seasonal update even throughout the expansion that adds an extra Paragon board or so that is like, you know, kind of filling the gaps a little bit for these builds. Other than that, I think it's kind of okay how they rework the Paragons. I'm quite excited to see how this will play out, how long it will take to get to 300. I'm not sure if anyone has actually done that on the PTR. It does take quite a long time to get to 300. Luckily, it also barely matters. So you want to get to 200, which is very fast. You see here, for example, my character starting from level 0 to Paragon 220 almost. I'm at 22 hours, and this is like, you know, improvable by a lot. So it's not that bad to get to like 200-ish, where you usually unlock all of the important stuff, and then the grind from 200 to 300 is like very slow and barely does anything, and that's kind of okay, I'd say. But yeah, for now, the glyphs are really the main problem that I have with this whole system. We'll see how this will change now with like, you know, maybe a squish or something. But yeah, I would like to see a bit more there. Now, runes. Runes are generally a pretty cool addition. I would have liked to see maybe more like actual D2 rune word nostalgia when it comes to like, you know, build your own unique kind of thing. I mean, rune words in D2 are basically just uniques with extra steps, and they feel kind of cool. The main problem I have with D2 rune words is that they are just like too OP generally and too easy to get, and they're kind of like just like power creeping the game. I mean, this is like, you know, old topic now, I guess, because it's Diablo 2, but I would like to avoid this in Diablo 4. However, I think it's cool that maybe you could find, you know, let's say white items that have like 5 sockets, and then you know, put together the rune word, and they have like, you know, all the pieces assembled, and then you have like this special unique basically with a rune word on top, and that has like all the runes listed. It just kind of feels cool, and I would like to see something like that in the long run as well. But for now, the way that the runes work, I kind of like it. I think that there could be way more focus on utility choices and less on DPS choices. It turned out that a lot of builds just kind of went with Warcry and Petrify, or if Petrify wasn't, you know, working or just like too hard to proc, then maybe they would go something else. But everyone would just go for DPS most of the time in endgame setups. Now that being said, I don't know what's the drop rates on this. If these runes are extremely rare and you find them like once every 50 hours or once every 100 hours, like these high-end, like, you know, legendary runes that give you Warcry or give you Petrify, I think it would be okay if that is kind of like the final unlock, and then you're like, you know, wow, I finally got it, let's go. And before that, you just try to make do with other stuff. I think this is actually how the rune system could work the best and the most interesting way. If those like really crazy runes are just maybe unchanged for the most part, but really rare. So I think that would be nice, because there are options that you can go for, and it would just kind of like, you know, give you this kind of progression and, you know, something to work on and something to hope for eventually to drop. And I think that would be really cool. But outside of that, yeah, I would like to see more stuff. For example, here, caltrops, smoke bombs, you know, more utility stuff. And I'm sure we're going to get more runes over the seasons, but this is more stuff that I would like to see outside of just like a generic damage buff like Warcry, for example. But yeah, there is a lot of like tweaking they can do with like the costs and the offering generation as well. I would also like to see more tools to generate offering, because sometimes it's a bit clunky to rely on standing still, for example, to proc a rune and stuff like that. I didn't really like that very much. But yeah, there's like, yeah, I just want more basically. And I certainly also want a rune stash. I want a stash tab that first of all has enough space to hold all of them and has like a slot for every single rune. Like there is a, you know, like a grayed out slot, and I want to catch them all and I want to fill that stash tab, you know, like the currency tab from PoE. That's what I want. Now let's talk about the classes a little bit. We're starting with the Barb here. We're going in alphabetical order. I didn't try Barb that much, but I had a really good time with Mighty Throw. That is a pretty powerful build, one of the strongest probably for the Barbs this season, especially with overpower versions. That seems very promising. Overpower builds in general are pretty good. The core skills are kind of down bad, so it seems to me like you're gonna play core skill involuntarily until you get a third blade, and then you're basically gonna be a ranged Barb immediately, and you're gonna do Mighty Throw. So that's kind of how that's going to go. There is the Thorn stuff, but it was omega bugged on the PTR, so I don't really know how good that will be. I heard from more experienced Barbs that this will probably be not that strong without the bugs. So maybe there's some work to be done here for the devs. Overall, I felt Barb was kind of okay. Just the core skills are relatively weak. Leveling is not as good. And in general, maybe they could lead like, you know, some bumps up here. And I also like to see something like Whirlwind or Double Swing builds that are actually Whirlwind or Double Swing builds, and similar to what I discussed earlier with the build diversity, not just a you know, catalyst to trigger Dust Devils and Tyrio's Might all the time. That's kind of getting old, and I would actually like to play like some really old school like double swing setup. I really love that stuff in like season 1, season 2, season 3. I played a lot of it, and it's just kind of sad that, you know, the core skills themselves are just not really popping off enough. There's also some potential for pet bars, but it has bugs as well, where they just stop doing stuff under certain conditions, which is kind of bad. But yeah, in general, I think that Barbs could need a bit of buffs. I think that the key passive nerfs that happened in Season 5 were probably a bit too much. We already saw that in Season 5, and we see it even more in the expansion that Barb is kind of on the weaker side of things, outside of like maybe 1 or 2 builds that are, you know, kind of catching up, but not quite with the top builds. So yeah, this is kind of like my feedback here. Otherwise, I think they have kind of decent build diversity, and there have been like some efforts made to like, you know, also make some other interesting stuff work, like Iron Maelstrom, like the Ground Stomp, like Charge. So there is like new tools to play around with. Is it enough to really make like functional builds out of these? I don't know, but I would like to see, you know, more in that direction as well. So, you know, bring back the core skills to their glory and just generally maybe bump them up a little bit. And I think Barb's going to be kind of okay here for Season 6. Now for the Druids, I don't have that much feedback. It seems like Druids has like at least a handful of really good builds, so they are kind of like popping off. Shred was really buggy. I wanted to try that, but it turns out that was like, it's just busted. And I'm not sure if it will be that powerful when those bugs are fixed, but I think it should be okay at least. But I did try the new Stone Burst skill, and it just feels very weak. It had a bug on the PTR that kind of multiplied the damage to a near infinity. So without that bug, if you avoided using that basically, then you actually understood that the skill doesn't really do much damage. And it definitely also needs some help. In addition to that, it just doesn't feel great to use. So even if it did damage, I think that the main problem is that this is a channeled skill, and then you have an aspect for it that is basically mandatory to use that skill effectively. And that aspect then removes the need to channel. You can still channel, but there's no point in doing so, because the way that the skill works is that it increases in size as you channel, and then after like a second or so, it's at maximum size, and then you go kaboom. But with the aspect, it's always at maximum size, and there's no point. So instead, you just kind of like spam tap your right click all the time, which makes no sense whatsoever. I would really like to see this aspect reworked to not put the size to maximum all the time, and instead, you know, maybe allow you to channel it longer and give it extra steps and extra explosion damage, so that you can, you know, decide, okay, do I want to channel for 1 second or for 2 or even for 3 seconds, let's say, pre-attack speed scaling, for example, and, you know, just kind of like, you know, increase the explosion that occurs at the end, and it's just like hit the entire screen, you know, kaboom. And, you know, I think this would feel really good, and you could put some really big numbers on that skill as well, because it's so slow paced. And I think then it would kind of get to the point where it makes sense. Because right now this whole Stone Burst design with the aspect that makes it just like a spam tap thing, you can't even hold down the button, because then you're just gonna stand there and channel for no reason. So it just feels clunky to use, it's not fun, it's weak, and it needs a lot of love. So this is what I have to say here. Outside of that, yeah, lots of stuff is very buggy on the Druids right now. So some of the most important legendary nodes just kind of turned off in Season 6 in this PTR and these kind of things. So that needs to be changed at least. And there's like, you know, dozens and dozens of other bugs with, you know, the skill tags not working properly or at the very least unintuitively. And yeah, there's a lot of cleaning up to do for Druids still, I think. Now let's talk about Necros. I really like the new Soul Rift skill. I've actually comfortably cleared the highest pit with that in the PTR. So that's probably like the third best Necro build now. We have 2 Bone Spirit builds and then a Soul Rift build. So this is what I gathered at least as like the top 3 basically. And Soul Rift is pretty fun to use. It is also just like a universally very strong skill to include in many builds. In fact, I think it's too good at utility because it is effectively just a better Bone Storm. So every build that previously may be considered Bone Storm in the setup now just runs Soul Rift because Soul Rift lasts longer, has a shorter cooldown, and does more for you. It gives you barrier, resource, vulnerable, and a damage buff. So everything you could ever want. There's actually no reason to ever run Bone Storm right now. So that is maybe a bit too much and could maybe be adjusted a little bit because it just leaves like this one ultimate to go into every build that doesn't require one of the other ultimates. So I guess in particular one of the Bone Spirit variations runs Blood Wave, Blood Lance runs Blood Wave, I guess. Maybe Blood Surge would do it. Yeah, outside of those, I don't really see that much use for any of the other ultimates. So that might be a bit too far here. In any case though, the minions are not in a good spot. Now personally, I don't care that much about minions, but I know a lot of people like the minion fantasy and it should be a viable setup. They had kind of their, you know, time to shine in Season 4 with the massive buffs, but a lot of the new stuff that has been introduced since then just doesn't really work well for the minions. And that is a bit of a problem. So I think that in general, there should be a more intuitive system for what works and what doesn't for the minions. Because right now, even myself, I keep asking what actually works. Like I have to go and test this because, you know, you can never be sure what happens with the minions. And as we learned, for example, some very important runes like Petrify rune just doesn't work for the minions. So stuff like that just kind of like makes them fall behind. And I think there needs to be some work done here where, like, you know, more stats apply from the character to the minions, more debuffs apply to the minions that, you know, you can put on the enemy, for example, and all these kind of things. And maybe some better scaling options and some better damage reduction scaling as well, since they've reworked Paragons. They kind of like made it very hard to get damage reduction for your minions, and it seems like this is a problem as well in the higher end. The new key passive was very good. I actually didn't talk about the key passives here, but well, Barbs was the Thorns thing, so it does this kind of like a build on its own. And for Druids, it's also the companion thing, so kind of like its own thing. For the Necros, it's a very universal one. And I think that kind of like fills a lot of the holes that the class had because we just kind of lacked some options in some cases. So that was nice. I think Bone Spirit and the Blood Wave Bone Spirit variants are too good, also due to some bugs. So they should be fixed because they were probably the strongest builds on the PTR with like literally dozens of millions of DPS or so, very optimized. That is definitely too much, I think. And Necros still have a lot of really good builds to look forward to, even if those are tuned down a little bit. For example, Sever. I played some Sever, that was very fun. Very cool new addition as well there. And I also really like that the Necro survivability increased a lot. So the Paragon has massively improved. Paragons on Necro used to be terrible. And they have added more life nodes and more damage reduction nodes all over the place. There's also now like a barrier generation passive on the skill tree that basically every build ever will go for. And you have the Soul Rift that also gives you the barriers. So in general, Necro has become a lot sturdier than in the past. And I had a really good time with that class compared to before, where it was always very squishy and very risky on hardcore and so on. So that has massively improved here. And one last thing here is the shields. I gave this feedback a while ago already, back in Season 4 PTR, I think. But I will gladly give it again. As long as shields cannot have weapon tempers, we cannot use shields, period. Especially these days where every weapon temper has become a multiplier for your damage, or for, you know, some parts of your damage at least, and this needs to change. Shields occupy a weapon slot, and yeah, I get it, they are not weapons, but they occupy a weapon slot and they need to have weapon tempers. It's fine that they don't have offensive aspects and they have like utility or defense aspects and they have different stats. You know, this is kind of like part of the you know, choice that you make in going between focus or shield, but no weapon temper just completely kills it, and there's no way to balance this out otherwise. I think this needs to happen. So I would really like to, kind of like embrace this shield fantasy in like a build where I can't fit any other defenses, for example, and I just have like, 4 unique armor pieces that give me only offensive stats or whatever, and then I'm like, okay, I need defense, let's go shields. But I can't. Like, I literally cannot, and no one can. So shields are just dead, basically. And that's very sad to see. Now, for the rogues. I played the rogue the most, almost the entire PTR, in fact. Generally, yeah, lots of cool stuff, lots of strong builds. I do not like the double dipping of a lot of the key passes, like precision and victimize double dips a lot of the glyphs, for example, and some other bonuses. So I would like to see that maybe adjusted. Those are also generally just like strong builds. Rogue in general looks like the strongest class out there, maybe only surpassed by the Spiritborn. And that's about it. So I think like fixing stuff like the double dipping would be a good start. And then, in general, maybe also looking at other things like, for example, trick attacks or something like that. That was introduced in Season 5 for no reason. I'm not sure why they buffed rogues in Season 5 in the first place, because they were already like near the top, and now they're just kind of like comfortably at the top, I feel. Outside of that, though, we have the Shadow Clone that still has not been addressed, and it's still a useless unique ultimate outside of getting 5 seconds of Unstoppable sometimes, or proccing a preparation, but you can do that better with Death Trap. So it's really just the Unstoppable, and the actual effect of the Shadow Clone remains completely useless. So I was actually surprised to see that there was nothing done for this skill. It's kind of like the one skill in the game that's just like doesn't work. And it hasn't worked ever, basically. And even now that we have like all this like chance to cast twice temper technology that has been introduced in Season 4, for some reason this was not applied to the Shadow Clones. So either do that or just delete that skill and give us something else. So this is just what I have to say here. For the Dance of Nice, that's the skill that you see in the background here, the new rogue skill. Very good, very fun. I think this is probably by far the most played build we're gonna see outside of anything Spiritborn in Season 6. It is just kind of the God Demon Hunter 2.0 from Diablo 3 that everyone loved. It's like one of the go-to farming builds of most people, and it will remain the same in this game. That being said, though, right now it has this problem that you can kind of just like spam tap it all the time instead of holding down the button, which is very uncomfortable and massively improves your damage and makes you not spend any of your charges. So that's kind of a huge problem here. So that charge problem needs to be fixed. And maybe the DPS could be adjusted up a little bit, because I think without that, this could maybe need a bit of a bump in order to be even better. Because this spam tapping, it also like gives you like triple DPS or something like that. It's too much. So once that is fixed, we need some compensation, basically. I mentioned double dipping, and shadow imbuement is maybe something that should be looked at a little bit for late game scaling. I tried to make this work with like some hyper alchemical admixture build, and I just couldn't kill anything with that. So even Torment 4 in like relatively easy content, I was not able to really use that. It's kind of like an early game thing, and I really like Shadow Imbuement. It just feels good to use, so I'd like to see more endgame viability here. But yeah, outside of that, I don't really have like a lot of like problems here with the rogue. I think the new key passive is also very nice. It kind of brings back poison builds in particular in like a really big way, like Poison TB, for example, really good. We have like a lot of cool stuff with like new builds like Death Trap, Rain of Arrows, Make Them Return. So we have lots of stuff here. So rogues are eating well, I think. And finally, we have the Sorcs. So for the Sorcs, I feel like the new skill just, you can use it. It's kind of like whatever. It kind of carries you in the early game, so up to like level 50 or even level 60. Apparently, it just kind of like kills the entire screen instantly with like the burn effect. But other than that, it just kind of falls off and can't really carry a build on its own. So it's more like a support tool that, gives you extra Conjuration Masteries, ranks, and so on. And speaking of Conjuration Mastery, I'd really like that passive to be reworked to only work for Conjurations in some way. Like this passive just does too much, and it kind of forces every single Sorc build to have as many Conjurations as possible. This is also what, for example, made this Lightning Spear Frozen Orb build exist, for example. And it's kind of like, weird, I gotta say, that we have to go this route on every single Sorc build. I would like to see that changed and make like more, flavorful, dedicated builds, like that don't have to put like 2 or 3 Conjurations on the bar, or, have like Ice Blades enchant or something like that all the time. I think this is just too strong. I think in general, Fractured Winterglass could also see a nerf. It's probably the single strongest item by far in the entire game. Like if you play a Frozen Orb Sorc before Fracture Winter Glass and a Frozen Orb Sorc after Fracture Winter Glass, the difference is ridiculous and way more than any other item for any other class. So in general, we still also have like just performance issues with that. If you see like multiple of these Sorcs popping up on a world boss, it starts lagging really crazy. Even single player, that is kind of possible. And it's also a build that is like so far ahead of pretty much everything else, outside of like a few outliers here from Rogue and maybe Necro, that I would really like to see a bit of like a adjustment here to, you know, maybe a lower chance to spawn all the stuff, so you get like less lightning spears. Maybe there could be a cap for lightning spears, although it is kind of cool. So maybe just like, you know, lower chances, or maybe like shift the focus away from the Frozen Orb stuff more towards lightning spear casting in some sort with the lightning spear build or something like that. Then Deep Freeze is just like not a skill. Shatter needs to be fixed. That still has the same double dip bugs from season 4 apparently, where you can like pop for like, you know, hundreds of billions or something like that with some weird multiplicative scaling. So that needs to be addressed, because with this there can be no really high-end content that is difficult outside of boss fights for Sorcs, for example, or like even for party play. You can just have one Sorc. We saw this in season 4 and season 5 as well. People played in party, and then the Sorc was just kind of like blow up everything basically, and that is too much. And yeah, generally I feel like Sorcs didn't really get much in this entire update. So the familiar skill, yeah, it's kind of there. It's not really doing much. Yeah, that's about it. Although I do like the new passives that I added. So there's like this new key passive that is actually finally like some multi-element key passive. The skill itself also has like this multi-element fantasy. We have like a rework of the Tarasha ring. So all that stuff kind of goes in the right direction, I think, where we just have more combos and not just pure lightning and pure fire and so on kind of builds, but you're not quite there. I would actually like to see builds where you really want to like maybe use Frozen Orb and Fireball together or something like that, or like Frozen Orb and Chain Lightning together, and these kind of things. I think this would be really cool, and we like, you know, we should work towards something like that as well. We have like the framework already, but we're not quite there because we have like a lot of specialization into, you know, a certain skill these days with like uniques and aspects, and we need something that really enables such a combo build, I think. But we are getting there, and I'm really happy to see this. Now, for some general stuff to round us up here, yeah, I mentioned actually Frostburn, Azarath earlier in like the build diversity part with like all these proc builds. They just seem like they were maybe missed in the Stat Squish or something, because their procs do ridiculous amounts of damage and kind of carry builds on their own very easily. And I think it's cool that we can make builds around them, but they seem like way out of proportion. So maybe it needs to be looked at again. I talked about the real rune stash tab as well. So that's just like something I would like to see here. And finally, my long-term wish list. So I talked about this, removing or lowering damage multipliers across the board. I would like to see lower numbers on the screen and like lower multipliers. And we just had like, you know, 6 seasons of power creep now, and we started with like way lower numbers, and now in the expansion, for example, they're raising the potential of legendary aspects to be even higher than before, and we have some aspects that give us, you know, literally double damage or something these days, and I think that's just too much. I would like to see aspects more as like a choice that actually, you know, switches something up, or that changes how something works in like a meaningful way. And they don't need to have an extra damage multiplier on top of that as well, I think. So for example, we have like the Hoda power. Now, I'm not saying that Hoda is a good build that should be nerfed. It's just an example. But Hoda power makes your Hoda now also hit everything around it in like this quake area, for example. But on top of this, your Hoda also deals more damage. And I think this on top, having extra damage just makes no sense. And like, it's already powerful enough to have this extra AoE, and I think it'll make more sense to either lower those numbers and just kind of like bring everything a bit more down to earth in general. If you're looking at Spiritborn legendary aspects, for example, this stuff gets even worse. I think Spiritborn seems heavily overtuned, and it makes slight sense where, you know, it's a new class and they want people to kind of like be successful with some unknown builds, because okay, we know all the builds, or most of them, from the old classes, but we don't know the builds of the new class. So having it like maybe a bit too powerful to start makes sense, because no one has a clue how to combine everything. You know, once the season or two have happened, I think that at the very least then stuff needs to be adjusted there. Right now, at least, looking like we're going in the opposite direction with like crazier and crazier numbers, and we're going more and more into D3 direction with like, you know, multiple hundreds of % multipliers on an item or something like that. I talked about Fracture Winter Glass and such other cases where I think this is just too much and we should go in the opposite direction. Now, another thing I would like to see long term is also leaderboards and conquests. The freestyle conquests were a major success, I think, in Diablo 3. And it's very sad that with all the tools that we have in Diablo 4, we don't have them. Why is there nothing like, you know, the first 1,000 people in a season to defeat Uberlilith, the first 1,000 people to defeat, you know, Uberduriel, you know, the first 1,000 people to reach Paragon 300, all this kind of stuff, I think are easy wins in terms of like making leaderboards. And there could be a ton of things like that would just be very fun, especially for season launches, for people to kind of like follow along, to measure where they are at, or just like kind of just see what the blasters are doing as well. A lot of people really like that. And also like leaderboards, for example, with the pit is a highly requested feature. I think this could work out, but the pit is just not really fun enough right now for this to really be that good. The problem with like pit pushing is that we end up with like 10-minute boss fights or something like that, which are just kind of generally boring. So as long as the boss problem is not fixed, I think maybe we shouldn't do this. Yeah, once bosses are fixed in some way, this could be done in many ways, then I think having like an actual like push mode and like a leaderboard mode with the pit would be kind of interesting. And I did talk about the D2 runes already earlier. This is my feedback here. So this has kind of turned out to be a very long video. So I hope that you enjoyed this. Let me know what you think. Let me know what you agree with or disagree with, or something that I have missed here. So of course there's more stuff to tell to the devs and more feedback to give here to you know, maybe have some things addressed before the launch. But for now, I gotta say, I'm very much looking forward to the expansion. Personally, I'll be maining Spiritborn anyway. I'm currently in the process of writing up those Spiritborn guides on Nextdoor, so stay tuned for a lot of stuff there very soon. And I will also, you know, see what's going to happen with like the other classes. I know after I've played so much Rogue, for example, I'm probably going to put out a few Rogue guys as well. Overall, very excited. I think it's going to be fun. I think a lot of the reworks they have done in the expansion are really good. And we have not even seen everything. We have not seen the Dark Citadel. We have not seen the Undercity. So there's more stuff to come. And I'm also quite excited to see what will happen there. So hope you enjoyed this one. And I'll see you guys next time.